This week, Pope Francis took possession of the Cathedral of Rome. The Pope starts making curial appointments, and there are 100 days to go until World Youth Day Rio. Hello and welcome to another edition of Vatican Connections. We're just coming down off the Easter high this week. Now, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, and like any other bishop, he has to take possession of his cathedral. On Sunday, Pope Francis took possession of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Elizabeth Lev, an art historian teaching in Rome for over 20 years, explains the significance of this Roman basilica.
The history of St. John Lateran, with its ecumenical councils, as the Cathedral of Rome, it has a very, very, very dense history, and that decoration very much reflects the vicissitudes of not only the church in the sense of the building, but really in the church in the greater sense as well. The beauty of St. John Lateran is the idea that the triumph that we're celebrating is the battle that made Rome Christian. And the only people who ever died to make Rome Christian, they were Christians. And this is the triumph of the witness of the martyrs. That church is the triumph of the men and women who threw themselves at that Roman machine for centuries, bearing witness to Christ, bearing witness to the truth of the Gospels, until finally 313 an emperor listened and allowed them to build a church. I mean, it is a unique victory in the ancient world. When you read Eusebius, who describes the building of this church, he was alive during the last major persecution, the persecution of Diocletian, which began around 301. And this was the persecution that was supposed to be the definitive one. He was going to smoke out and rid the world of Christians. So Eusebius was alive, on the run during that persecution. He lives long enough to see Diocletian's persecution fall, to see Constantine rise, the legalization of Christianity, and the construction of the first church in the world. I mean, when he writes about it, he writes with this sense of this jubilance, which is just wonderful to listen to. And I think that that's the feeling we're supposed to feel when we walk into that church, that reminder that no matter how dark, dim things are, the church, it will always get up, it will always keep going, and it will always triumph.
Now, just before the Mass, Pope Francis dedicated the piazza in front of the Basilica to Blessed Pope John Paul II. And then after the Mass, he came out onto the balcony of the Basilica and gave a special blessing to the people of Rome who were gathered there. That's just one more Roman tradition. This week, there are officially 100 days until World Youth Day Rio, and here is the latest update on how preparations are coming along in Rio.
Hello. This week's edition of World Youth Day Minute brings the latest news from the local organizing committee for Rio 2013. The director of the Museum of Sacred Art in São Paulo visited the Cultural Acts section this week. The Cultural Acts section also met with those responsible for the exhibition on Saint Therese of Lisieux. This week, confirmations of acceptance and refusal will be sent for exhibition proposals for the performing arts and music during the Youth Festival at World Youth Day. Last weekend, a commemorative stamp of World Youth Day was launched. At the event were the Archbishop of Rio, Don Orani, who is also the president of the local organizing committee. Also present was the creator of the World Youth Day logo, Gustavo Hugening, and representatives from the post office. The first printing edition was for 600,000 stamps, which you can buy at any post office in Brazil. A workshop for the communications section was held in the John Paul II building. Professionals from the fields of photography and cinematography were present. A campaign was launched called Eu Faço Parte, in English, I Take Part, which promotes the use of the World Youth Day logo in parishes. It is for non-commercial use only. For more information, please send an email to the address below. The movement, Quero Mais JMJ, in English, I Want More World Youth Day, was created with the intention of making the event even better. To learn how to take part, visit the address below. That was more of World Youth Day Minute. We'll be back next week with more information about the preparations at the local organizing committee for Rio 2013. World Youth Day Rio 2013. The heart of the world beats here.
Now, the steady stream of visitors to the Vatican continues. This week, it was Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. We'll have more on that meeting just a little bit later in the program, but Francis Rocca, the Catholic News Service Rome Bureau Chief, talks about the tradition of popes meeting with the head of the UN.
It's a mosaic from Rome.
The whole United Nations project is in many ways deeply consonant with the values and priorities of the Catholic Church. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, one of the key UN documents, was highly influenced by Catholic social teaching. Popes Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI all spoke at the United Nations, pleading for the overcoming of nationalisms and concern for the poor in the world. Unfortunately, over the years, the UN bureaucracy has increasingly promoted what it calls reproductive rights, abortion, and birth control around the world in conflict with Catholic values. Still, the Holy See, which has had an observer at the United Nations since 1964, judges that it needs to be involved in this important forum so that it can oppose threats to peace and justice that cut across national boundaries today.
Last week, we brought you part of our conversation with Father Thomas Rosica and Sebastian Gomes, who were working at the Holy See during the papal transition. This week, we bring you the second installment of that conversation, where we talked about what has already changed under Pope Francis and why some of these changes might be a shock to the system for some Catholics. There's been two different sets of language that we've heard. We've heard about the break with tradition, and we've heard about the evolution, the continuity. And Bergoglio himself, in a book that was written with him in 2010, talks about how you can't take history and forget it, but you have to take what you've been given from the past and build on it. So talk to us about this shock of the resurrection, the quote-unquote break with tradition, but how it's actually a continuity.
Let's talk about tradition with the big T and tradition with the little t. Certainly the tradition with the big T, this is not a pope who's going to come in and undo the major tenets of the faith and the tradition into which we have all been baptized in this great tradition of Catholicism and Christianity. It's the small t's sometimes that confuse people, and I think that people, when they become too accustomed to or familiar with the small t's, and make that the ever unchanging, immutable, constant that must always exist. That's not what the tradition of the Church is. And here's what I mean by that. That we have a very poor sense of history in this part of the world. And some of the traditionalists that are finding it very difficult to swallow what Pope Francis is doing may be stuck on the small t's, and they forget the bigger T, the bigger tradition. And so when we are stuck on externals, when our life of faith and our life of church is really locked in a sacristy, when we're only speaking to the gallery and speaking to those who are like-minded, when we're so tied up with our inner church, inner house struggles and difficulties, and we forget the missionary dimension of the church, which is sent to baptize the nations, we have difficulties. And I think those are many of the difficulties that people are experiencing at present. In the life of Cardinal Bergoglio in Buenos Aires and in the life of Pope Francis, this is clearly not going to be a church that's locked in querelles de sacristie, as they say in French, quarrels of the sacristy, quarrels about liturgical dress, quarrels about who should be participating or shouldn't be participating in rituals. This is about the gospel of Jesus Christ that must be announced in a world that's often hostile to a message of love. And the other thing, and I know Sebastian has some wonderful perspectives on these, the other thing is, one of the great insights and gifts of Pope John Paul II was to give us the teaching of divine mercy. Dives et Misericordiae, the second encyclical of John Paul II, the beautiful teaching that was developed of Sister Faustina, and we saw how all of that was unpacked in that pontificate of John Paul II. But I must say, I've been distressed that many of those who have advocated divine mercy, who have been proponents of this mercy, who wear it on their sleeve, know very little of how to put that into practice. And so the language of mercy, the language of forgiveness, the language of inclusion has often been clouded over by the politics of exclusion, dictating everybody who shouldn't be caught up in the circle of God's forgiveness and mercy. Pope Francis, I am convinced, is aware of that. And from day one in the Sistine Chapel, his first homily, it was about mercy. And the second Sunday there, the Sunday we saw him celebrate Mass in Rome at St. Anna's Church, the woman caught in adultery, the gospel, that Sunday of Lent, I was so moved by what he said. You know, do we want to contribute to the mercy or the misery of humanity? And I think he comes from a part of the world that has been immersed in misery. He knows the suffering, the dirty war, the poverty, the villages, the places of misery, they call them, the villages of misery. And one thing he did in Buenos Aires, which always impressed me, he said, it is not enough for priests to visit those places and bring communion to the people in misery. You've got to go live there. So he assigned priests to live in the villages of misery. And for me, that is a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly right. The church has to always be reflecting on itself. And the thing we need to reflect on is, to what extent and to what degree are we telling the story of the gospel? Is the life of the church and the structure of the church in line with the gospel? And someone like Francis, who was talking about all these gospel essentials, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, love, communion, community. When the gospel essentials hit you in the face, they really hit you in the face. And I think this is the utter shock across the world. It's not just people within the church, it's people who are non-believers, people who are falling to their knees, people who are going back to church, people who are raising questions about their own lives and about the way that society functions and works and the way we get along with each other. So all these, Pope Francis has provoked through the gospel essentials all these big questions. And so it's funny because it's nothing new. And things he's talking about aren't things that are foreign, as Father Tom said, to our tradition. They are our tradition, and they're our foundation. The foundation is the gospel, the foundation is Jesus and what he stood for. And Francis stands for all those things. When I see Pope Francis, I see the gospel personified. You know, one of the things, we were also had the privilege of being at the Synod of Bishops on the new evangelization in October, and we heard bishops and cardinals from all over the world talking about, what do we need to do to help tell the story, to help tell the good news, to tell the message about of Jesus Christ, bring that to the world in a way that makes sense to people today. And very quickly, it stopped being an us versus them kind of scenario, what's happening outside of the church versus what's happening inside the church. It was, wait, what are we doing to contribute to the lack of faith or the crisis of faith that has come across, that has swept across the world? And some of the themes that came out of the Synod were humility, simplicity, reflection on our own lives, on our own personal encounter with Jesus. These sort of things that Francis personifies. So we know if the bishops of the world were talking about how the new evangelization has to start with getting back to basics ourselves, that's Pope Francis in a nutshell.
Did you know the Holy See is a permanent observer at the United Nations and chooses not to be a full member? The Holy See wants to maintain complete neutrality in political situations. Things are starting to return to a bit of a more normal pace at the Vatican now after Easter. Pope Francis is holding regular meetings with members of the Roman Curia. He has already met 3 times with Canadian Cardinal Marco Ouellet, who is head of the congregation that appoints bishops around the world. He had a few other meet and greets too. The Holy Father met with Dr. Nicholas Schneider, who is the head of the Council of the Evangelical or Lutheran Church in Germany. Dr. Schneider expressed his appreciation for the name Francis because he said it speaks to all Christians in a very effective manner. The Pope and the Lutheran leader also spoke about ecumenism, the way martyrs speak to all Christians, and the anniversary of the Reformation, which happens in 2017. The head of the Argentinian Bishops' Conference, Archbishop Hector Auger, met with the Holy Father as well. Now we know that Pope Francis has sent $50,000 in aid to victims of the recent flooding in La Plata, which is on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. The Pope also met with Ban Ki-moon, the head of the United Nations. Popes have met with the various Secretary Generals of the UN in the past. This meeting was meant to show the Holy See's appreciation for the UN's role in promoting peace and the common good in the world. The Pope and the UN leader spoke privately for about 20 minutes. According to the Holy See, they spoke about human trafficking and the situation of women, refugees, and migrants. Ban Ki-moon told Pope Francis he intends to focus on conflict prevention during his second term as UN Secretary General. At the end of the meeting, the 2 men exchanged gifts. Pope Francis gave the UN leader a mosaic featuring a panorama of Rome, and Ban Ki-moon gave Pope Francis a blue-bound volume that contains the United Nations Charter in various languages. And as we mentioned earlier, Pope Francis took possession of the Cathedral of Rome this past Sunday. That is, of course, the Basilica of St. John Lateran. During his homily, Pope Francis said God never tires of waiting for us to return to him. His patience calls forth in us the courage to come back to him. Pope Francis cited various examples in the Gospel. Thomas, who is skeptical, but Jesus is patient and waits for him to come around. Peter, who denies Christ, but Jesus is also patient with him and merciful. And the disciples on the road to Emmaus, who don't recognize that Jesus is walking with them, but he just waits until they finally recognize him. Pope Francis said, "Let us be enveloped by God's mercy and trust in his patience." After the Mass, he greeted the faithful who had been waiting in the piazza. He thanked them for attending and said, "Now we go forward together, the people and the bishop." And later in the day, Pope Francis led the Regina Coeli from the window of his office. Before leading the prayer, he said, "Peace is the fruit of the victory of God's love over evil." Jesus gave that same peace to the apostles to spread to the world, and we should not be afraid to live as Christians, sharing that peace with others. Pope Francis has also continued celebrating his daily Mass in the chapel of the Domus Santa Marta with different groups of Vatican employees and Santa Marta residents. Of course, on Wednesday, Pope Francis held his weekly general audience at St. Peter's Square. He said being a Christian means letting Jesus take possession of our lives, change our lives, transform our lives, and free us from the darkness of evil and sin. He told those gathered in the square not to listen to the voices that try to convince us that God doesn't matter, and resist the temptation to put God to one side. Peace and joy come from knowing we are loved by God, and Christians have an obligation to be signs of hope in today's world, which is plagued with sadness and despair. And the St. Michael's Choir School from Toronto was at the Vatican this week, and they had the rare opportunity to sing for the Holy Father. Jubilate Deo. After the audience, Pope Francis tweeted, "Being a Christian is not just about following commandments, it is about letting Christ take possession of our lives and transform them." An hour later, he tweeted, "If we act like children of God, knowing that He loves us, our lives will be made new, filled with serenity and joy." The daily Vatican News Bulletin is once again filling up with resignations and nominations, so let's find out who has a new job. First up, an appointment to the Roman Curia. Father Jose Rodriguez Carballo is a Franciscan priest, and up until this week, Father Rodriguez Carballo was the Minister General of the Order of Friars Minor. As of this week, he is the Secretary for the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life. The new position also elevates him to the rank of Archbishop. And Vilnius, Lithuania has a new Archbishop, and he comes from Washington, D.C. Bishop Gintaras Linias Grusas. Archbishop-elect Grusas was born in the U.S. to Lithuanian parents. He studied computer science at the University of California in Los Angeles, and then he worked for IBM for 4 years. He studied in Steubenville and Rome, and he intended to serve the Lithuanian community abroad, but after a summer in Lithuania as a seminarian, he was asked to stay. So he was ordained and incardinated into the Archdiocese of Vilnius in 1994. Fargo has a new bishop. Monsignor Thomas Folda was appointed Bishop of Fargo this week. He is currently the rector of the seminary of Seward, Nebraska. Dubuque, Iowa has a new archbishop. Bishop Michael Jackals of Wichita was appointed to Dubuque this week. And Archbishop Brian Udagwe was made a nuncio just before Pope Benedict's papacy officially ended. This week, Pope Francis assigned him to be nuncio to Benin. Now, as always, this is the part of the show where we take your questions and try to give them an answer. This week, Tony Jenko sent us an email. He asked, will the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops invite Pope Francis to visit the home base of 2 recently canonized saints? Well, to answer your question, Tony, I went to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and asked them about any plans to invite the Pope to Canada. They advised that no invitation has been made. Also, remember that the Canadian bishops are due for their ad limina visit sometime in the next year or so. Although there are no plans to make an invitation to the Holy Father at this time, who knows what might happen between now and that ad limina visit. Vatican Connections is interactive. Send us your questions or comments by Facebook, Twitter, email, or post. Via email, send comments to info@saltandlighttv.org, and by post, send letters to 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1, Canada. Last week, we told you about Pope Francis's visit to the necropolis under St. Peter's Basilica, the 2nd century burial plots that surround the place where St. Peter is buried. In this week's Roman Profile, we take a look at the layers of Rome and what they tell us about our history as a church.
The city of Rome, and one of the reasons everyone loves to come to the city of Rome, is that the past is so present in Rome, that the past is touchable. But one of the things I think that is not always so evident when you go to the Colosseum or you go to the Forum, you see the past all laid out for you. But actually, what Rome shows us is the past in layers, so that we see an early past and a slightly later past and a slightly later past, all layered on top of one another, kind of like an onion. And as archaeologists, what we do is we crack open the onion and we peel back the layers. And the first layers we peel back are the most recent ones. And as we get down into the onion, we get to the lowest ones. And where we are right here on the Chilean Hill, in the Church of San Giovanni in Paolo, we actually get to literally walk through all these layers. So when we walk down these stairs, we will walk into a 2nd century AD rich, posh house. And as we go up, we will go up through the centuries, and we will come up just on top of our head is where the actual floor of the 5th century AD basilica is. So we go through 3 centuries of time, and we get to see all these levels as they're superimposed on one another and as they interact with each other. Because the other thing you can see in Rome is how people responded to their own past. And what is amazing about the Church of San Giovanni in Paolo is you see Christians actually responding to their own past, maybe inventing that past, reverencing that past. So this church is deliberately and very carefully and at great expense built on top of a series of Roman houses. These houses were visited even at the time the church was built, all through the Middle Ages, and we can see this in the archaeological record. We can actually see the past being carefully curated, almost like an ancient archaeological park. And this, only in Rome can you get these layers of the past. We've always known that Christianity grew up in families, and you read the letters of Paul, and the letters of Paul are directed to family members who gathered around them, small Christian groups. What is interesting, and what we know now, is how long this continued even after Christianity became a legal religion. So I would say, really, for a century, after Constantine, there is still this emphasis on the family group, that neighborhood churches probably still are meeting in houses, that basilicas that are used for daily use, if you like, or Sunday use, they grew up very slowly, even in Rome. So it really takes about almost a century for real Christian building to get going within the city. I'm not talking about burial. That happens pretty fast. But within the city itself, it's a long process. And the home really remains, I would argue, the center of Christianity for much longer than we had previously thought.
And that's it for this week's edition of Vatican Connections. From everyone here, thank you for watching, and join us next week as we bring you more of what's going on in Rome with Pope Francis.